This story is called Noises and Mr. Flibbertyjib. Mr. Flibbertyjib had a most unusual rumble in his head. It went rumble, 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 and then it went bumble, bumble, bumble. Now Mrs. Flibbertyjib didn't mean to, but she made Mr. Flibbertyjib's rumble and bumble worse than ever. You see, Mrs. Flibbertyjib cooks the finest roast beef in town, but no one can cook roast beef without closing the oven door shut and covering the roasting pans bang. Mrs. Flibbertyjib knits mittens all day long, and no one can knit mittens, even one mitten, unless the needles say click, click, clickety, click. Click and knit, knit and click. Mrs. Flibbertyjib says that Mr. Flibbertyjib has a rumble in his head because he eats too little roast beef and doesn't wear his mittens. He says he has a large rumble in his head because the house and the town are full of noises. She says nonsense. Then the old clock strikes. Bong, bong, bong. 3 o'clock, Mr. Flibbertyjib. The telephone shouts, bring, bring. Answer me, quick, answer me. And the grocery boy at the back door says, tap, 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 answer me. Then the telephone rings again. Too much noise, says Mr. Flibbertyjib. The gray mouse that lives in the kitchen wall peeks out of the mouse hole. Cheese, says the gray mouse to herself, and scampers softly over the floor like a gray shadow. But Mrs. Flibbertyjib sees her. Eee! Screams Mrs. Flibbertyjib. Squee! Squeaks the little gray mouse. See, says Mr. Flibbertyjib, too much noise. Nonsense, says Mrs. Flibbertyjib, and gets off the chair. Well, says Mr. Flibbertyjib, suppose he goes downtown to buy some red yarn for Mrs. Flibbertyjib's mittens. The first thing he hears is clang, clang, clang. Then Mr. Flibbertyjib, he walks to the curb and gets ready to cross the street. He looks to the left and to the right, then he puts his left foot down, and around the corner comes beep, beep, beep. Then, says Mr. Flibbertyjib, he walks to the curb and gets ready to cross the street again. He looks to the left and looks to the right. He puts his right foot down, and around the corner comes clop, clop, cloppity, clop. It's no wonder, says Mr. Flibbertyjib, that my head rumbles. Every time, not just once at a time, I go to buy red yarn, the policeman blows his whistle. Whee! Goes the whistle. The fire engine races by me. Ooh, woo, woo, woo. And when I get home again, the front door always slips out of my hand and goes bang. You should eat your roast beef, Mr. Flibbertyjib, said Mrs. Flibbertyjib, and she often did, and wear your mittens. Nonsense, shouted Mr. Flibbertyjib, giving his umbrella a good hard bump. The noise, it's the noise. Roast beef and mittens, says Mrs. Flibbertyjib. Noise, roared Mr. Flibbertyjib. Well, this went on for days and days, and Mrs. Flibbertyjib went on the roasting the finest roast beef in town. She went on making mittens, red mittens, blue mittens, and yellow mittens. Mr. Flibbertyjib's rumble in his head went on rumbling, and at last Mr. Flibbertyjib came home in a rage. I can't stand this rumble, 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 and bumble, 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 he said. We will go to the country where everything is quiet. Everyone knows the country is quiet and a very good place for rumbles and bumbles. Very well, Mr. Flibbertyjib, said Mrs. Flibbertyjib. So Mr. Flibbertyjib packed up his brown shoes and his blue suit and his red tie, and he put his hat over the rumble in his head, and he was ready to go to the country. And Mrs. Flibbertyjib packed up her roasting pans and her knitting needles and yarn, and she was ready to go to the country. Poor Mr. Flibbertyjib. The train whistle said, toot, 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 all the way to the country. And every crossing bell said, ting, ting, and a little ting, all the way to the country. But at last, Mr. Flibbertyjib and Mrs. Flibbertyjib got to the country, and Mr. Flibbertyjib unpacked his brown shoes and his blue suit and his red tie and went for a quiet walk. And Mrs. Flibbertyjib unpacked her roasting pans and her knitting needles and her yarn and began to cook a fine roast of beef. They were so tired from all the packing and unpacking that they went to bed as soon as they had eaten supper. Oh, this is the life, said Mr. Flibbertyjib, who hadn't eaten any of the roast beef. Poor Mr. Flibbertyjib, he had just turned off the light and closed his eyes when, hoo, 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 said the owl. Poor Mr. Flibbertyjib. He was sure he had just hopped into bed. He was sure he had just gone to sleep. He was sure it was just the beginning of night when cock-a-doodle-doo, cock-a-doodle-doo, said the rooster. And Mr. Flibbertyjib ran down the stairs and out of the house. Shh, shh, he said to the rooster. I'm a poor man with a rumble and bumble in my head. Cock-a-doodle-doo, shouted the rooster, and the hens said cluck, cluck, cluck. Oh my, cried Mr. Flibbertyjib, what's next? Then there was bow, wow, 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 said the dog, and meow, 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 said the cat. Then the ducks came a-waddling to find a place for swimming. Quack, 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 said the ducks. And the old windmill turned and turned in the wind, and it pumped water, and the horse came to drink. Squeegee, 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 said the windmill. I must turn and turn. Soon Bossy will come for her drink of cold water. Blow me around and around, Mr. Wind. Squeegee, squeegee, squeegee. And the Bob White called from the green field. Bob White, Bob White. The big bossy cow said, moo, moo. The pails went clank, clankety clank as the farmer's biggest boy carried them to the barn. And Mr. Flibbertyjib head went rumble, 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 and from his left ear to his right ear, and bumble, 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 from his right ear to his left ear. Less noise, shouted Mr. Flibbertyjib. More roast beef, said Mrs. Flibbertyjib, and your mittens. Well, now, it might be that you are right, said Mr. Flibbertyjib. I hope so, for I have found that town or country there will always be noise, noise, noise. So Mr. Flibbertyjib sat down at the table, and first he ate a small piece of roast beef, then a very large piece of roast beef, and in the afternoon he was pleased to find that the bumble, bumble, bumble was gone from his head. The next day he ate 2 very large pieces of roast beef and a slice of bread covered with rich brown gravy. When he went outdoors, he wore the red and yellow mittens Mrs. Flibbertyjib had very kindly made for him. He was pleased to find that the rumble, rumble, rumble was gone from his head. This is a fine place, the country, said Mr. Flibbertyjib that night as he watched the big round moon. He listened to the owl asking, hoo, hoo, and not a bumble, bumble, bumble did Mr. Flibbertyjib's head hear. Fine place, the country, said Mr. Flibbertyjib, and the next morning he jumped out of bed before the sun was up. When the black rooster hurriedly, sleepily to the fence to crow the sun up, there was Mr. Flibbertyjib. Cock-a-doodle-doo! Listen to me try it, said Mr. Flibbertyjib. Cock-a-doodle-doo! Very good, said the rooster. Now listen to me. And he took a deep, deep breath. Cock-a-doodle-doo! And not a rumble, rumble, rumble did Mr. Flibbertyjib hear. Now Mr. Flibbertyjib and Mrs. Flibbertyjib go to the country every summer and to the big city every winter. And from that day to this, Mr. Flibbertyjib is always eating plenty of roast beef, and he always wears his red and yellow mittens, except, of course, when he's eating roast beef. And not a rumble, 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 or a bumble, bumble, bumble does Mr. Flibbertyjib ever hear. The end.